The iron gates of the Carlisle estate closed like a sentence, slow, calm, irreversible. On the waterfront driveway, Audrey Carlisle stood with her cane and a single suitcase at the curb, as if someone had quietly erased her from the life she helped build. A guard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ma'am, your car is waiting." Behind the tinted glass upstairs, Mason Carlisle, 37, untouchable, the kind of man people called boss, only when they thought no one was listening, didn't come down. His silence was the order. Audrey didn't beg. She only lifted her chin toward the window, because she knew her son was watching. Jonah, 12, watched his mother's knee tremble, watched the cane slip for a heartbeat, heard the clean metal clank when the gate sealed shut, and in that exact moment, he made a choice his father couldn't threaten away, buy off, or bury. The truth. But here's what no one saw coming. Jonah didn't just witness his mother being thrown out. He collected the first piece of evidence that could bring down an empire. Like the story? Hit like. Share it with someone who needs it. And subscribe, because what Jonah does next changes everything. Audrey didn't look back. She walked as if stopping for even a single second would make her fold right there onto the cold stone behind her. The wind off the river stung her eyes, but she forced herself not to blink too much. Because if the tears fell, she was afraid they'd drag a sob with them, and with it everything she'd been holding tight in her chest. The crutch tapped a steady rhythm on the sidewalk. 1 beat, 2 beats, slow and sure, like a reminder that she still had control over this body. But every footfall sent a small blade of pain up her calf and straight into her knee. The pain didn't explode. It just smoldered, stubborn and persistent. The kind that wears a person down over time. Audrey didn't know where she'd sleep tonight. She only knew she had to get far enough from that gate before they changed their minds in a worse way, or before these legs betrayed her. Ahead lay the river road, the streetlights just coming on, the traffic thin. She didn't dare call a taxi through an app. Her phone still had battery, but she didn't want to leave a trace. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she knew Mason's world, where safety sometimes came from disappearing at the right moment. And the cruelest part was that she'd learned that lesson from him. She passed a bus stop and paused beneath the shelter. She took a deep breath and tried to press her heartbeat back into something normal. A small thought flashed through her mind, cold as a needle. If Jonah called, she'd answer. If Jonah texted, she'd reply. She couldn't disappear from her son. But when she looked at the screen, her heart dropped straight through her. No signal. Not because of the area. The network icon flickered as if someone were squeezing it shut. Audrey tried to dial a familiar number, but the call wouldn't go through. She bit her lip and gripped the phone so hard her knuckles went white. She understood immediately, showing her no explanation. This wasn't just being thrown out. This was being cut off from every line of contact, cut off from the only thing left that still gave her a reason to stand upright. She stood still for a moment, listening to the water slap the bank, then forced herself to move again. She chose a direction at random, avoided the crowded routes, searched for somewhere with light and a few people passing by, but not so exposed. She moved like a shadow, trying not to leave footprints in snow. Somewhere else, Jonah was still behind the walls of that house, but he wasn't looking out anymore. He forced himself away from the window, forced himself to walk slowly, as if nothing had happened, because he knew that in this house, everything had eyes. People would notice if he ran, if he cried, if he shouted. Jonah walked down the hallway, his ears still holding the sound of metal just shut, the footsteps of a guard, the voice of a housekeeper trying to speak as if everything were normal. He wanted to fly down the stairs, to pound on the door of his father's office, to ask why. But he swallowed it all like swallowing a stone. Ahead of him, the living room door sat slightly ajar. Through the crack, Jonah saw Paige Holloway standing with her spine straight as a blade. Paige's voice wasn't loud. It was even soft, but each word fell like an order. Paige said everyone had to stay quiet, that no one was to post anything, no one was to call the press, no one was to tell the story in their own way. And then Jonah heard the sentence that turned his scalp to ice. Paige wants it clean tonight. Jonah didn't understand every layer of what that meant, but he understood enough to know this wasn't one of his father's tempers. This was a plan, a script, a way to wipe the image clean. He stood frozen, his breathing so small he couldn't even hear it. Inside the room, someone asked a question. Jonah couldn't see the man's face, but he recognized a male voice. Where is she? The question wasn't exactly pity, and it wasn't anger either. It was the chill of someone used to giving orders, used to controlling the coordinates of everything. Paige answered quickly. Jonah only caught scattered words about a car, about a driver, about a temporary stop. Then his father's voice cut in, short as a hammer striking the table. No contact. Jonah felt his throat tighten. No contact. Not just cutting his mother out of the house, but cutting her off from her child. And in that moment, Jonah realized the most terrifying thing wasn't watching his mother being taken away. The most terrifying thing was that she would vanish from every line, as if she'd never existed at all. Jonah backed away one step at a time, went to his room, and closed the door as softly as he could. He leaned his back against it, eyes wide and unblinking, as if one blink would turn everything into a truth that couldn't be saved. Then he looked down at his phone. It was still there, but the screen was dark, and he remembered his father's order to collect every communication device after dinner. Jonah didn't have much time. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old mini voice recorder he'd used for a school project, a thing that had seemed useless, and now had become the most valuable object in his world. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to be calm, like a grown man. He pressed record, then held the device close to the crack of the door, where the sounds from the living room still carried. Paige kept talking about removing photos from the Foundation's website, about changing the interview schedule, about how, if anyone asked, the answer was that Audrey needed a private rest. Jonah recorded everything. Each word was a small brick, and he stacked them in his pocket like evidence. And when Paige repeated that sentence again, "Paige wants it clean tonight," Jonah felt a sharp pain in his chest, but he also felt something harden inside him. He lifted his eyes to the ceiling, as if he could see through layers of concrete to wherever his mother was walking in the night. Jonah whispered, letting no one hear, like an oath, "I'm going to find you, Mom." Then he looked at the recorder still running, its tiny red light blinking. That was evidence A. And Jonah knew that if he did this right, it wouldn't only pull his mother back into the light, it could shake the entire empire his father believed no one could ever touch. The red light on the recorder went dark like a blink, but Jonah stayed still for a few more breaths, his ear pressed to the door, straining to catch any sound moving toward his room. In this house, everything had order, and order was always built out of details so small they looked harmless. He hid the device in the deepest crack of his drawer, beneath an old t-shirt, then tugged his sleeve down over his trembling wrist and forced himself back into the shape of an ordinary boy before anyone could walk in. Downstairs, Paige Holloway ran the house the way she'd run an emergency boardroom. Jonah heard the quick, decisive click of her shoes, heard her voice calling people by name, never needing to raise it, and still getting an immediate answer. Orders came out in a politeness that was almost frightening. No one was to have private conversations. No one was to use a personal phone in the common areas. Any questions from outside had to go through a single point of contact. Even the cook was told to switch shifts to avoid any chance encounter with a delivery driver. Jonah couldn't see the screens, but he caught fragments as Paige mentioned the Carlisle Foundation website, changing the homepage photo, changing the family section, changing the introduction as if she were fixing a typo. With Paige, a person's existence could be erased with a few clicks, a few replacement lines, a new story that ran smoother. Jonah heard her talk about the press schedule, about a call with a donor, about moving a photo shoot to next week, about canceling a local interview and then setting it again when the timing was appropriate. It all happened fast and clean, like a campaign practiced for a long time, and Jonah felt something inside his chest turning colder, because he understood his mother wasn't only being pushed out of the house, she was being pushed out of the story. A low voice cut through, and Jonah didn't need it repeated to know it was his father, Mason Carlisle. The voice wasn't sharp, but every other sound automatically shrank, as if the house had learned to make room for his presence. Jonah heard his father ask a short, cold question, carrying none of the feeling Jonah had been begging for. "Where is she?" For a split second, a foolish hope sparked in Jonah, as if his father still had a part that wanted to make it right, to bring her back, to stop before everything went too far. But that hope was smothered almost immediately. After a beat of silence, Paige answered in a practical tone, reporting a destination the way she'd report cargo. And Jonah heard his father repeat the line Jonah had recorded earlier, this time clearer, sharper. No contact. Jonah felt as if someone had closed a hand around his throat. No contact meant no calls, no messages, no searching. No contact meant turning Audrey into an empty space, and turning Jonah into a boy who had to live inside that emptiness and still smile on cue. Paige followed at once, as if it were obvious, saying that for Jonah's safety, because the situation was sensitive, because there were always people lurking outside Mason's world, Jonah had to stay in the house for a while. Jonah knew the phrase "for your safety" could be nothing more than a cloth draped over a shackle. He heard his father agree, then call someone in. Another man's footsteps approached, a rough voice answering yes. Jonah heard a name, someone who would drive him, manage his schedule, make sure Jonah didn't go anywhere alone. No one said it outright, but Jonah understood he'd just been placed inside a comfortable cage. A little later, there came a knock at his door. Jonah opened it with a face he'd already managed to smooth flat. The man standing there wasn't a stranger, but today his eyes were different, harder, like he'd been handed new orders. In a gentle voice, he said Jonah's phone had to be held for the time being, that it was policy until everything stabilized. Jonah handed it over without resisting, because he knew resisting would only make them wary. He asked only one small question, trying to make it sound like an anxious boy, not someone collecting facts. "When can I see my mom?" The man didn't answer directly. He only said everything would be arranged later. Jonah nodded, closed the door, and stood still in the middle of his room, listening to the retreating footsteps the way you listen to a lock turning one more time. He went to his desk and opened his old laptop out of habit, then realized the Wi-Fi password had been changed. Jonah let his breath out slowly and looked around his room the way you look at a scene of evidence, and then he saw it. The small camera on the bookshelf was still there, the one his father had said was for protection after a few threats in the past. But its angle was different. Yesterday it faced the window. Today, it stared straight at the bed and the desk, aimed directly at where Jonah usually sat, aimed directly at the drawer where he'd just hidden evidence A. Jonah stepped closer and looked up into the glossy black lens, and the cold went sliding down his spine. This wasn't protection. This was surveillance. This was house arrest. Inside a luxurious room, Jonah didn't touch the camera. He didn't turn it off. He didn't do anything that might trigger the system. He just stood there for a few seconds, long enough to carve the new truth into himself. In his father's world, power didn't only close gates, it also turned lenses. And if Jonah wanted to save his mother, he was going to have to learn how to live under that stare and still hide a secret big enough to shake the whole house. That night, Audrey kept walking until the streetlights began to blur in the fog, and every time she stopped, she had to wrestle with the thought that if she sat down, she might not be able to stand up again. The pain in her left leg was no longer a gentle reminder. It became an invisible sound hammering at her temples, steady and relentless, as if it wanted to tear through the calm she was forcing herself to hold. She tried going into a small station to ask to charge her phone, but the employee's wary eyes made her understand she couldn't stay long. She didn't want to explain. She wanted even less to hear someone ask why a woman dressed neatly, carrying a suitcase, was wandering around like someone lost. She only needed a place with light, with people, and most of all, without questions that dug too deep. When she saw the weathered neon sign of a small diner in Hoboken, the warm yellow glow spilling onto the sidewalk reached her like a hand offered at exactly the right moment. Audrey went in on what little strength she had left. The door chime jingled. The smell of coffee and baked bread rolled out to meet her, and her throat tightened with a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. The feeling of safety. The woman behind the counter looked up, hair pinned into a neat bun, flour still clinging to her hands. Her gaze wasn't prying. It measured only one thing, quickly and cleanly: whether the person in front of her was about to fall. She stepped out from behind the counter and set a glass of warm water on the nearest table. She didn't ask a name right away. She didn't ask a story right away. She only said, with a gentle firmness that kindness didn't allow to be refused, "Sit down first." Audrey sat. Her hands shook when they touched the glass. The warmth seeped into her palms and nearly broke her open, but she swallowed it down. When the woman asked if she could manage, Audrey only nodded, then said one short sentence, like someone used to carrying her own weight, that she could work. Any work. Wiping tables, washing dishes, anything, if it meant a place to sit tonight. The woman looked at the crutch, looked at Audrey's tired eyes that didn't beg, then gave a small nod. She introduced herself as Eleanor Briggs, and said there was a little room in back used for storage, and Audrey could sleep there if she was willing to help in the morning. No papers, no contract, no story pulled apart for entertainment. Just a simple trade between two women who understood that there were nights when a person only needed to be treated like a person. Audrey didn't talk about iron gates or mansions. She didn't say the name Carlisle. She didn't let a single syllable from her old world fall onto the tile floor of this diner. She only said thank you, then rose and limped after Eleanor toward the back, feeling as if she had stepped out of a room full of cameras and into a small corner where no one needed to control her. The next morning, Audrey woke to the clatter of dishes and the smell of hot butter. The pain was still there, but the feeling of being hunted was not. She wiped tables slowly, washed dishes, stacked napkins, did everything her body would allow, and Eleanor didn't rush her, didn't push her, only set out an extra chair now and then so Audrey could sit and rest without having to ask. By afternoon, a few children stopped in after school, their backpacks dragging across the floor as they ate and argued over homework. A little girl dropped into the corner table, eyes red from not understanding a math problem, and Audrey, almost on instinct, the instinct of someone who had once stood in front of a classroom, walked over and asked if she wanted help. The child looked up, glanced at the crutch, at Audrey's hands, then slid her notebook forward as if handing over a secret. Audrey sat down. Her voice was quiet and patient, without a trace of pity. She simply explained each step, drew each line, letting the girl find the answer herself, the way you find your way back to the belief that you're not stupid. Then the other kids drifted over, not out of curiosity, but because they could feel it, that here was an adult who didn't yell and didn't hurry them. Audrey began tutoring for free every afternoon, a few minutes per child, as if the shape of words could stitch closed the cracks inside her. One day, when Audrey stood up a little slowly because her leg flared with pain, a boy noticed, his voice hesitant, as if he was afraid saying it out loud would embarrass a grown-up. "You're hurting and you still come." Audrey looked at him. Her smile was thin but real, and she answered simply, "No sermon, no sad story. Because someone once came for me." The sentence landed on the table like a seed, and Eleanor, behind the counter, paused with a towel in her hands and looked at Audrey a moment longer, as if she understood that this woman didn't only need a place to sleep. She needed a reason to keep standing up. But as the afternoon slid on, Audrey didn't notice that at a corner table near the window, a man in a baseball cap had been sitting still for too long, the coffee in front of him untouched. He didn't look straight at Audrey, but the phone propped beside his cup had its camera angled just enough to frame her as she bent over the children's work. And in the moment, Audrey tilted her head and smiled at the girl, the phone screen lit with a small red dot, like an eye opening in the dark. That night, when Audrey turned off the light in the small room behind the diner and lay down on the folding bed, she still didn't know that her image had already left Hoboken before she even fell asleep. The man at the corner table had posted a short video online. No long caption, just a simple line. Something like a teacher helping kids for free at a diner. And that very simplicity made it spread fast, like fire catching wind. The next morning, Eleanor unlocked the door, and before she could even brew the first pot of coffee, a regular walked in, holding up a phone, half astonished and half excited, asking if it was her. Audrey was wiping tables. She looked up and caught herself on the screen, bent over explaining a problem to the children, hair falling softly across her forehead, the crutch propped beside the chair like a piece of punctuation no one could ignore. She didn't have time to react before another person came in, then another, the whispers spreading like ripples. Some were moved, saying they hadn't seen an adult that patient in a long time. Some were angry on her behalf, guessing life had pushed her into this place. And some were suspicious, asking why someone like her was in a small diner like this. Audrey felt her throat go dry. She wasn't afraid of attention. She was afraid of being seen by exactly the people she was trying to avoid. But social media didn't need a real name to make a big story. Within hours, the video was shared onto other pages, dressed up with sharper headlines, heavier speculation, more questions about the faint mark of a wedding ring still on her finger, about an old suitcase barely visible in the corner of the frame. By noon, a local New Jersey news account reposted it with an invitation for anyone with information to reach out, and the comments split cleanly into two camps, one calling it inspiring, the other insisting it had to be some kind of stunt. Audrey stood behind the counter with a towel in her hand and stopped wiping, feeling as if hundreds of eyes were shining straight into the back of her neck even though there were only a few customers in front of her. Eleanor looked at Audrey once, then calmly turned the radio up as if to lay sound over the tension, saying that in here they still served food and there were still kids who needed homework help and whatever was happening out there could let the wind carry it away. Audrey tried to believe her, but by late afternoon the door chime jingled again, and this time, the man who stepped in didn't look like a regular. He wore a dark coat, neat and fitted, no hint of hurry, standing straight like someone trained to take up space without showing off. He didn't scan the room for a table. He looked straight at Audrey, as if he'd known exactly where she'd be. Audrey felt cold slide along her spine. The man walked up and set a thick envelope on the counter, without bothering to pretend warmth. His voice was low, polite, and gave no room for refusal. "Someone wants you safe. Just sign." Eleanor started to come out from behind the counter, but Audrey lifted a hand to stop her, her eyes never leaving the envelope. She opened it and saw crisp, printed pages, long blocks of legal language, the title reading a non-disclosure agreement, and beneath it, a check with a number written out in words, large enough to make a life less hard for many years. In the bottom corner was another promise, about housing, about medical expenses, about protection if she cooperated. Audrey looked up at the man. He didn't introduce himself as media. He didn't mention Paige. He didn't offer the soft corporate lines. He stood still like a statue, hands set in front of his stomach, eyes tracking the diner the way someone marks exits. A back door, the placement of cameras. Audrey had lived in Mason's world long enough to recognize the difference. Public relations people talked a lot, smiled at the right moments, tried to make you feel respected. This man stayed quiet and measured, as if every answer had already been prepared and every reaction was accounted for. He wasn't press. He was house. Audrey heard her heartbeat grow louder. She thought of Jonah, thought of her phone blinking in and out with no connection. And she understood that this envelope wasn't only meant to buy silence. It was a way to close the story before it had time to grow. The man slid a pen toward her. "Just sign, ma'am. We'll make sure you don't have trouble." Audrey picked up the pen, felt the cold ink beneath her fingertips, then set it down. She didn't throw the envelope. She didn't tear the papers. She didn't make a scene for other people to film. She only pushed it back toward him, her voice so steady it surprised even her. "I'm not for sale." The man didn't frown. He didn't flare. He only looked at her for one beat longer, as if confirming something about her character. Then gave a small nod. He gathered the envelope back up and said one short sentence, more reminder than threat. "I'll report back." Before he left, he glanced at the children, bent over their work, then looked at Eleanor, not with a direct threat, but with enough cold in his gaze to drop the temperature in the room. When the door shut, Eleanor let out a breath and said quietly that those people weren't like anyone she'd ever seen. Audrey didn't answer. She only looked out the window, and that evening, when the diner was being cleaned and ready to close, she saw it. A black car parked across the street, lights off, windows dark, engine silent, no one getting out. It simply sat there, like a black period in a picture, to remind her that her silence was no longer only her own choice. The car did nothing at all, and that was exactly what made Audrey understand the message. "We know you're here, and we can stay here as long as we want." While the black car sat in silence watching the diner in Hoboken like a shadow that refused to leave, on the other side of the river, Jonah sat in his room, and the feeling of being stared at had never been so unmistakable. He was used to wealth, used to the fact that the house had security, but he had never been used to his own room becoming a place of confinement. The camera on the bookshelf still pointed straight at his desk. His phone had been taken. The internet password had been changed. Even his school schedule had been rearranged like music with someone else holding the tempo. But Jonah didn't rebel. He understood that in his father's world, rebellion was an alarm bell. Jonah chose the harder way, the way of staying quiet and obedient, so they would believe he was just a child in shock who would adjust. In the morning, he sat at his desk, opened his books, answered when the supervisor asked questions, nodded at the right moments, and only when night fell, when the hallway grew quieter, did he begin to do what he needed to do. Jonah had watched the camera long enough to learn it had one small blind spot, a corner where, if he shifted his chair and lowered his shoulders, the lens would only catch the top of his head and the pages of a book. He pulled the chair into that exact position and opened an old laptop he had hidden on the bottom shelf of his closet, something he hadn't used in a long time because it ran slow and overheated, but it was the only thing that still belonged to him. Jonah couldn't use the house network, but he remembered there was a guest network reserved for charity parties, an old password taped under a table in the library, a place where adults assumed children never paid attention. He had seen it once when he was younger. Jonah tried again from memory, one character at a time, breathing out slowly, and when the connection icon appeared, his heart pounded, as if he had just run a long distance. He didn't dare open social media. He didn't dare send messages through common apps. He chose email, an older address he had once seen his mother use to contact her closest friend, Tessa Park. Jonah typed a short line. No long story, no mention of his father, no address, only that he was Jonah. He needed help for his mother, and he needed her to reply in the safest way possible. He sent it, then shut the laptop immediately, as if one more second would get him caught. Jonah waited in silence, his whole body pulled tight like a string. The next morning, when the supervisor brought breakfast and lingered outside the door for a few seconds to watch him, Jonah kept his face neutral, kept holding his book, even asked an innocent question about a test. Only when the door closed did he open the laptop and check his inbox. A reply was already there. No subject line, just one sentence. Jonah, don't stay on the house network long. Give me a clean way to reach you. His chest tightened with relief and fear at the same time. Tessa had received it, and Tessa understood exactly how dangerous this was. Jonah thought fast. He couldn't call, but he could send a compressed audio file and name it like homework. He opened the drawer, took out evidence A, transferred it to the laptop, and sent it in a second email, without any long explanation. He added only one line. I heard them that night. I'm scared they're going to erase my mom from everything. He cleared the history, shut the laptop, then got up and went to shower like it was an ordinary routine. By afternoon, Tessa replied with a tight sequence of instructions, like someone who didn't let emotion crack the structure. She told Jonah he had to save the original link to the video that was spreading, take screenshots that showed the time on the screen, document any changes on the Foundation website, and absolutely not hack or break into any system, because they needed a clean file that no one could flip back on them. Jonah read it and felt both warm and cold. Warm because someone believed him. Cold because he understood this fight couldn't be won with anger. It had to be won with documents and timestamps. Tessa told Jonah to send anything else he could get legally. Screenshots of memos, event schedules sent through internal email, anything within his line of sight that didn't require breaking locks. Jonah began doing exactly that. He pretended to ask the supervisor about his new schedule, asked to see the printed copy, then secretly took photos. He searched his desk drawers for papers Paige had left behind when they checked his room, and photographed the important lines. He did it little by little, steadily, like building a wall out of small bricks. That night, Tessa sent a message that made Jonah sit bolt upright. Jonah, I found something connected to the non-disclosure agreement. She didn't say much in the email, but he saw the attached screenshot, basic metadata, the file creation date of the NDA template, and the line cut him cold. The NDA file had been created before the gala. That meant before the video went viral, before anyone pretended to worry about Audrey's safety, before any excuse was pulled out to serve as a cover. They had already prepared a path to push his mother out and lock her mouth shut. Jonah stared at the screen until his eyes burned, not because he couldn't believe his father could be cruel, but because he could see now, clearly, that this wasn't a decision made in the heat of a moment. This was a script, a plan with a signature waiting, and if it was a plan, it had a weak point too. Jonah typed back to Tessa, his hands still shaking, but the words appearing clean and clear. I'm not going to run. I'm going to get one more nail. What do you need next? He hit send, then leaned back in his chair and listened to the air conditioner humming like the house breathing. In Jonah's eyes, everything had changed color. He wasn't a child waiting for adults to show mercy. He was someone collecting evidence to open a different door. A door that not even a boss could close with silence. That night, when Jonah stared at the line that said the agreement file had been created before the gala and felt his world flip onto a different face, he suddenly remembered there had been a time when his father wasn't a name that made people lower their voices. A time when Mason Carlisle was just a much younger man, living in a cramped apartment in Jersey City, working himself to exhaustion, his eyes always looking sleep-starved, his hands marked with small scratches from the kind of work that never makes it into the polished stories. Jonah wasn't there in those days, but Audrey had told him, and the fragments of his mother's memory stitched themselves together in his mind into a picture he had never truly dared to look at head-on. Audrey met Mason on a rainy evening, in a community class where she tutored adults, the kind of class where everyone arrived carrying their own story, and no one asked too many questions. Mason sat in the back row, dark coat, silent as a shadow, but his eyes fixed on the board as if each word could save him from something. Audrey didn't ask what he did for a living. She only asked if he needed more paper. And Mason, a man who usually didn't accept anything for free, took that sheet with the smallest nod. Later, Audrey learned Mason was trapped between two roads, one paved with fast money and thick darkness, one slower, but with a chance to keep what was still human in him. Audrey didn't save him with sweet persuasion. She was simply the only person who didn't look at him like a weapon, didn't look at him like an investment, didn't look at him like a card to play. She looked at him like a person who could choose. Mason was used to every relationship being an exchange, so Audrey's unconditional kindness made him wary at first. He would disappear for days and then come back. He would answer texts with clipped sentences. He would stand in the rain outside her door without knocking, as if he only needed to know there was still one place with a light that didn't ask how much dirt he was carrying. Audrey once said something simple to him on a night when he sat silent on her sofa, his hands clenched white, his eyes fixed on empty space like he was listening to a gunshot replaying in his head. She told him that if he wanted to become a better man, he had to start by living like a human being. Mason didn't answer, but the next morning, he returned to the class and sat in the front row for the first time. Then Jonah was born, and everything changed. Mason began climbing fast, so fast that even Audrey couldn't fully keep up. More money, a bigger house, more security, and closed-door meetings that stretched deep into the night. Audrey kept teaching. She kept taking Jonah to the park. She kept cooking dinner as if they were an ordinary family. There were moments when Mason would lean in the doorway and watch mother and son, and his eyes would soften, as if in that instant he remembered who he had been before this world sharpened him into a blade. Then the accident happened. On a gray afternoon with a fine mist of rain, the car slipping on a wet stretch of road. No blood, no horror on the pavement, only the sound of impact, and the instant everything tipped. Audrey injured her leg, and pain became her new companion. Jonah was little then. He only remembered his mother lying on the sofa with an ice pack, still trying to smile so he wouldn't be afraid. Mason was there. He lifted Jonah up. He held Audrey's hand so tightly. His eyes were red with panic, not because he was weak, but because he hated the feeling of not being in control. He called a doctor, called a car, called every kind of person. And in the middle of it all, a toxic thought began to take root in him. A thought his world was always whispering. A weak point is a target. Disability is an invitation. A woman who walks with a crutch won't only be pitied. She'll be used to aim at him. Audrey didn't see that thought at first. She only saw Mason tightening the circle of protection around the house, controlling her schedule more and more, reminding her not to go out alone, not to appear in crowded places, not to let anyone take pictures when she was tired. Mason said it was love. It was concern. But in his eyes, love was slowly being blended with survival strategy. Each time Audrey hurt and moved more slowly, Mason saw not the wife he had once needed, but a vulnerability that could cost him everything. And in that world, losing everything wasn't only losing money or reputation. It was losing power. And losing power meant losing his life, or losing Jonah, or losing the whole house to someone else. Jonah grew, and he began to see that his father lived like he was always waiting for an attack. The doors stayed locked, the curtains stayed drawn, the guards changed shifts on the hour. No one was allowed to surprise anyone. In that obsession, Mason turned what he feared into what he caused. He erased Audrey from the frame before an enemy could use her to strike him, and he convinced himself it was protection. But when Jonah sat in his room and read Tessa's email about a plan that had been prepared in advance, he understood something even more painful. His father didn't hate his mother. His father was afraid, and fear, dressed in power, could make people cruel while still believing they were right. At the same time, elsewhere in the city, Mason stood in his dark office with a phone pressed to his ear, listening to a man on the other end give a thin laugh. They were mocking the video. They were calling Audrey the weak point. They were saying it would only take a light touch to make the entire Carlisle empire shake. Mason didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, the city lights like eyes. His hand tightened. And in that moment, his decision stopped being only a family matter. It became a chess match, where Audrey was treated like leverage. And Jonah, though no one knew it yet, had already begun collecting the first pieces to flip the board. After the call filled with his opponent's thin laughter, Mason didn't need to bark orders. One short message from his office was enough to set the image machine in motion. Paige Holloway did exactly what she did best, turning truth into a version that was easy to swallow and hard to argue with. Within a single day, Jonah saw small, chilling signs appear around him like invisible cuts. On the Carlyle Foundation website, the family photo that had once shown Audrey standing beside Jonah was gone, replaced with an image of Jonah centered in the frame, the foundation logo behind him, and Mason in a dark suit, the model father with a smile measured to the perfect degree. The old caption had been swapped for a new one that sounded full of compassion, something like Audrey needed time for private rest after a difficult period with her health, and the family thanked everyone for respecting their privacy. Jonah read it and felt his insides clamp tight. Not a single sentence was entirely false, but the way it was arranged turned his mother into a side detail in her own life, someone who should step into the background so the story could look prettier. Then, older posts on the foundation page were edited. Photos from past events where Audrey had appeared were replaced with different cropped frames, or removed entirely under the excuse of content updates. Jonah realized Paige wasn't only cleaning up the present, she was rewriting the past, as if his mother had never stood in the light at all. He wanted to slam his fist on the table. He wanted to run downstairs and shout that they had no right, but he remembered the camera watching him. He remembered Tessa's warning that if he wanted to win, he had to win clean. Jonah did the harder thing. He pretended not to notice. He ate dinner on schedule. He answered politely. He accepted supervision like a child who was slowly getting used to it. But when night came, he pulled his chair into the blind spot, opened the laptop, and began taking notes like someone building a case file. He screenshot every change on the website, saved original links and visible timestamps, documented the differences between cached versions and the new ones. Tessa guided him step by step, how to preserve public evidence without touching internal systems, how to compare image metadata, how to locate older versions through legal sources. Jonah followed every instruction, bit by bit, and each time he hit save, he felt as if he were pulling a thread out of the expensive coat Paige had draped over this empire. But Paige wasn't only editing what the public could see. She also started teaching the people around Jonah how to speak. Every time a housekeeper crossed paths with him, there was a strained smile, the same lines repeated, that his mother was resting, that everything would be fine, that Jonah should focus on school. The uniformity told Jonah they'd been coached, and that uniformity was what frightened him, because it proved something simple. When the Carlyle family wanted a story to exist, they could make the whole house speak in one voice. Jonah shifted part of his work toward listening. Not pointless eavesdropping, listening to understand how far Paige was running the plan. One evening, when Paige held a staff meeting in the large dining room, Jonah passed by as if by accident, as if he'd forgotten a book, and he heard phrases hit his ears like stones. No one was to say Audrey's name in front of guests. If anyone asked, the answer was private recovery. Everything had to be clean and quiet. That phrase made Jonah stop short. Clean and quiet. It was something his father had used for years. Whenever trouble flared in the house or in business, his father would say it in that calm voice, as if it were a life philosophy. Jonah stood behind the wall and felt as if he'd just heard his father's fingerprint pressed onto the plan Paige was executing. He went back to his room and wrote the phrase in his notebook like a marker. That night, Tessa sent Jonah a file. She didn't write much, only that she had received it through a legal channel, from someone who was too tired to keep speaking in the same voice. Jonah opened it and saw an internal memo, short and brutally clear. Remove Audrey from frame. Keep Jonah centered. Jonah read it again and again, his heart pounding. This was what he needed, something no one could dismiss as rumor. At first, he thought of Paige immediately. She wrote it. She carried it out. She stood in front of everyone and called it protecting privacy. Jonah was about to type a furious email back to Tessa, but his eyes stopped on a small line beneath the memo, a note about tone and how to answer the press. And there it was again, the phrase clean and quiet. Jonah went still. It wasn't Mason's signature. It didn't carry his name. It didn't bear his stamp. But it sounded like him so completely Jonah couldn't deny it. And Jonah understood what hurt more than the fact the memo existed. It could exist because in his father's world, people had grown used to the idea that erasing someone from the frame was a reasonable choice. Whether Mason had typed those words himself or not, his power had created an environment where Paige believed it was right, the staff believed it was safe, and the whole house believed silence was the only way to survive. Jonah looked at the memo, looked back at the photos that had been replaced, looked at the soft captions Paige had written, and he felt a cold clarity rise up in place of anger. If they could rewrite the past with a few clicks, then he had to bring the truth to a place they couldn't erase, couldn't edit, couldn't force someone to repeat on script. Jonah wrote one single line to Tessa, short and heavy like a stone dropping into water. "We need a stage they can't turn off." And when he hit send, Jonah heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and steady, like someone coming to check. He shut the screen at once, closed the laptop, turned back to his desk with an open book ready, his face calm as if he'd been asleep for hours. But in the drawer, the memo was saved, and inside Jonah, a new plan was forming, not for revenge, but to make sure the truth survived every click Paige Holloway could make. After Jonah sent the message about a stage they couldn't turn off, and after the memo was hidden away like a bone tucked into a pocket, the outside world began tightening its grip even faster. The black car in front of Eleanor's diner was no longer just a shadow. It became another heartbeat on the street, showing up on time, stopping in the same place, turning everyone who passed into quick, uneasy glances. Audrey understood the message perfectly, but she still opened the diner each afternoon. She still spread notebooks out for the children. She still sat down with them as if nothing could force her to disappear again. She wasn't naive enough to believe kindness would soften people, but she also refused to be led by fear. That evening, after the children had gone home, Eleanor was clearing tables and Audrey sat in her usual corner, her hand rubbing lightly at her knee to ease the ache, when the door chime jingled again. Not a customer. Not the man with the envelope. Not anyone who belonged to this diner. The man who stepped in wore a dark coat, no logo, no display, and yet the room seemed to lower its volume on its own. Mason Carlyle didn't arrive with a crowd. He didn't bring the loud voice of power with him. He came alone, or at least he looked alone. But Audrey knew a man like Mason was never truly alone. Silence followed him like a second coat. He didn't look around for a seat. He looked straight to where Audrey sat, and in that single moment, Audrey saw something very small, very human, pass across his face and vanish just as quickly, like a heartbeat held back. It was when he saw her bending to pick up a pencil a child had forgotten, when he saw her hand tremble with pain and still hold on to a smile. One beat out of rhythm. Then Mason returned to stone cold, as if emotion was something he couldn't afford to show, not to anyone, not even to himself. Eleanor stepped half a pace in front of Audrey by instinct, but Audrey gave a slight shake of her head. She didn't want Eleanor pulled into this. Mason came closer and stopped at a distance near enough to speak, far enough that no one could call it intimacy. His eyes landed on the crutch leaning beside her chair, then lifted to Audrey's face. His voice was low and controlled, not angry, not pleading. "You should come home." Audrey didn't answer at once. She waited for him to continue, because she knew that in Mason's world the first sentence was always a hook for the condition. And of course it was. Mason laid out the terms the way you read house rules. Come home, but don't appear in public. Don't attend events. Don't respond to the press. No interviews, no photos, nothing anyone could grab onto. He spoke as if it were a generous concession, as if allowing her back into that house was already an act of kindness. Audrey listened, and it felt like listening to a man negotiating over something valuable but fragile. Something that had to be placed behind glass, so no one could touch it. She looked at Mason, the man who once stood in the rain outside her small apartment, who once held her hand in a hospital room, who once said he wouldn't let anyone make her feel ashamed. And now he stood here in a working diner, talking about taking her home the way you take a secret back to its hiding place. Audrey drew in a breath. The pain in her leg flared sharp enough that she had to grip the edge of the table to keep her composure, but her voice stayed level. "If I go back, what will I be in that house?" Mason didn't blink. "You'll be safe." Audrey gave a very small smile, not because it was funny, but because it hurt. Safe. She had heard that word too many times in the last few days. It was a polished lock, hiding an ugly truth. She tipped her head so the diner light caught in her eyes and asked the question she knew would make him bleed in a way no one could see. "Am I your wife, or am I your secret?" The question dropped between them like a weight. Eleanor at the counter seemed to stop breathing. The space thickened, and all that remained was the faint clatter of the ice machine. Mason looked at Audrey for one beat longer, and in his eyes was something deep and tired, like a man who had built his whole life on never being allowed to be weak. He could have answered with 100 lines about strategy, about risk, about enemies, about how they would use her as leverage. But Audrey didn't need that lecture anymore. She needed one simple admission that she was still a human being in his eyes, not a weak point. Mason opened his mouth, then stopped. He didn't answer her directly, and that silence was like an invisible slap, more painful than a blunt refusal. Audrey felt her throat tighten, but she wouldn't let it become tears. She only stood up slowly, leaning on the crutch, letting Mason see what each small movement cost her. She spoke softly, but with an edge that didn't bend, like someone who had decided she wouldn't go back into a cage, even if it were lined with velvet. "I'm not coming home." Mason remained where he was, like a wall that wouldn't allow itself to fall. But Audrey saw his hand tighten for the briefest moment, a reflex forced down. He looked around the diner, at the old chairs, the crooked picture on the wall, the marks of an ordinary life he no longer belonged to. Then he gave a single nod, not acceptance, but acknowledgement. No argument, no begging, only one short, cold word that told Audrey this wasn't over. "Fine." He turned and walked out, and when the door chime jingled again, Audrey felt as if she had just stepped out of a storm, while the sky still hadn't cleared. Mason left without a spoken threat, but his presence left something clearer than any sentence. When a boss couldn't get what he wanted with words, he would get it another way. And Audrey, even as she said no, could feel herself standing at the edge of a turn where every choice from now on would come with a price. After the night Mason left the diner in that cold silence, Audrey didn't sleep much. She wasn't afraid of the noise outside. She was afraid of the kind of quiet Mason left behind. The quiet of a man who was used to deciding other people's fates with a single nod. The next morning, Eleanor opened the place as usual, brewed coffee as usual, hung the special of the day as if life didn't hide empires behind dark glass. Audrey worked slowly, keeping herself busy so she wouldn't think about Jonah for too long at a time. But near midday, the door chime jingled, and this time it wasn't the footsteps of a younger man in a dark coat. The person who walked in was an older woman, posture straight, silver hair brushed smooth, an expensive cream coat, no showy jewelry, and still she carried power. She didn't scan the diner like a stranger. She looked the way someone looks when they've come to inspect property. Eleanor stepped forward on instinct, but the woman only gave a slight nod, her voice low and polite, as if she were speaking to an employee in a place where she was used to giving orders. "I'm looking for Audrey Carlyle." Audrey felt the cold settle in her chest. She didn't need an introduction, but the woman still placed her name on the table like a stamp. Margaret Carlyle, Mason's mother. She walked closer without hurry, without rush, every step measured. Audrey stood and gripped the crutch more tightly, not to defend herself, but to keep her balance against an invisible pressure. Margaret looked Audrey up and down. There was no open contempt in her gaze, only the cool appraisal of someone who believed the world had a natural order, and she was the one who knew how to keep that order in place. She didn't sit right away. She waited for Audrey to signal. When Audrey gestured to the chair across from her, Margaret sat down slowly and placed her handbag neatly on her lap like a ritual. No one in the diner heard every word, but everyone felt the air change. Margaret began in a gentle voice. No insults, no scolding, no heavy lines needed. "I hear you've been refusing the protection the Carlyle house can offer." Audrey held her gaze. "I'm not refusing protection. I'm refusing to be hidden." Margaret's smile was thin, as if that was exactly the kind of answer she had expected from Audrey, and she had prepared for it. She tilted her head, her voice still soft, but each word was a narrow blade. "You think this is about feelings. You think if you stand tall and talk about dignity, everything will be fine, but you don't understand Mason's world. In that world, weakness is danger." Audrey listened, and a small flame lit inside her, but she didn't let it rise into anger. She had lived in that world long enough to know that arguing with Margaret would only convince her that Audrey lacked control. Audrey only said, slowly, that she understood danger better than anyone, and that was exactly why she would not accept becoming a shadow. Margaret placed both hands on the table, nails perfectly tended. Her voice didn't rise, but the air seemed to grow heavier. "You still don't understand. You look at Paige as the enemy. You think what happened these last few days is the work of a woman in communications." Audrey didn't speak, but her eyes darkened. Margaret continued, as if teaching a lesson about power. "Paige is only a tool. The things you call protocol, the memos, the captions, they aren't Paige's ideas. This is how this house lives. This is the culture of this family. This is how we keep the people inside safe. Audrey felt as if an invisible door had swung open, revealing a room she had only ever smelled from the outside. This wasn't a sudden crisis response. This was a system. A tradition passed from older hands to younger ones, the way recipes are handed down. Except this recipe was meant to erase people from the light. Audrey tightened her grip on the crutch and kept her voice steady. If that is this family's culture, then I don't belong to it. Margaret didn't argue. She only looked at Audrey the way you look at someone who has just admitted they don't fit into the real world. Slowly she said it, still polite, still concise, but each word was a clamp. You may not belong, but what about Jonah? Audrey faltered, just slightly. Margaret struck in that exact moment, pressing the blade into the softest place without ever raising her voice. Jonah is Mason's son. Jonah is the future, and the future can't be put at risk because of an adult's emotions. Audrey felt her heart speed up, but she held her face steady. Margaret went on, and this time she delivered the turn that made Audrey go cold, because it didn't aim at Audrey. I didn't come here to threaten you, Audrey. I came to remind you that a boy who says what he shouldn't say becomes a burden. A boy who talks becomes a liability. The English sounded like a principle lifted from the family's private book of law. Audrey looked at Margaret and felt as if she had just heard her son's future placed on a scale. Margaret leaned in, her voice dropping lower, not to hide, but to add weight. You can endure being talked about, but Jonah cannot. This world doesn't forgive a child who exposes his father's weakness. Audrey wanted to spring up and say Jonah was only a child, that no one had the right to call her son a burden. But Audrey's clarity held her in place. She understood Margaret didn't need to shout, she only needed to plant an idea. Because in that world, an idea was a weapon. Audrey looked straight into Margaret's eyes and answered in an even voice, a vow not for Margaret but for herself. Don't touch my son. Margaret smiled, then stood and adjusted her coat like she had just finished a business meeting. She said she hoped Audrey would make a wise choice, then greeted Eleanor politely, as if she had only stopped in for a cup of coffee. When Margaret left, the chime jingled, and the air in the diner seemed to lighten a little, but Audrey still felt a stone pressing in her chest. Eleanor came over and asked quietly if she was all right, and Audrey only shook her head, because she didn't want Eleanor to see her hands shaking. When night fell, Tessa called a safe number Eleanor had provided, her voice tighter than usual. Tessa said Jonah had just sent a short message, that he could feel everything tightening fast, and Tessa had also received information about Margaret's visit. Eleanor repeated Margaret's words exactly. Jonah on the other end of the line was silent for a long time. Then he spoke softly, and his voice was no longer the voice of a hesitant child. Time's up. And in the darkness of a room under a staring camera, Jonah understood that from this moment on, every minute of delay could turn him from a witness into exactly what Margaret had named him, a liability. After Margaret's line about a boy who talks becoming a liability, Jonah was no longer allowed to exist as an ordinary child. He became a problem to be managed, and Paige Holloway managed problems with what she did best, story. In a single morning, Jonah watched the world around him bend in ways so subtle that if he hadn't been paying attention, he might have believed it was all happening because of him. The supervisor handed him a new school schedule printed on thick paper. It looked official, packed with busy blocks like a plan designed to stabilize him. But Jonah studied it and saw what mattered had been cut away. His after-school club time was gone. His sports practice had been replaced with private tutoring. His weekend time with friends had been changed to family visit, with no mention of which family. Jonah asked lightly, the way a child asks out of habit, what about the meeting with his science project group? The supervisor answered that the school had rearranged things for Jonah's best interest. That phrase again, best interest, like a velvet glove wrapped around a tightening hand. Jonah went downstairs and saw Paige in the living room with her laptop open, one earbud in, speaking to someone in that smooth voice, weaving in phrases like psychological support, stable environment, and minimizing negative impact from social media. Jonah didn't catch every word, but he caught enough to understand Paige was laying the foundation for a new story, one where Jonah wasn't a witness to injustice, but a child who had been stirred up. When Jonah got to school, the change was even clearer. His homeroom teacher called him into the office, the look in his eyes a mix of pity and concern, as if Jonah had been through something adults had to handle carefully. The teacher said the school had received an email from the family, requesting limited, unnecessary contact and an adjusted schedule so Jonah could focus on academics and safety. Jonah asked who the email was from. The teacher only said from a family representative. Jonah heard the word representative and cold slid along his spine because he knew it was Paige. During break, Jonah noticed a few close friends had been moved to different seats. A teacher said it was random, but to Jonah, it looked like a wall going up, invisible and effective. One friend tried to come over and was sent on an errand. Another tried to text Jonah to ask if he was okay, and the message wouldn't send. Jonah's number blocked, or Jonah's phone no longer allowed to receive. Jonah had never seen isolation happen so smoothly. No one bullied him. No one threatened him in the hallway. They simply took away the threads that tied him to the world and called it care. And to make sure Jonah wouldn't be believed, Paige started pushing a story that was even more poisonous. On a few local entertainment pages, vague lines appeared about a mother trying to manipulate her son to pressure a famous father. No names, but everyone could guess. People used words like unstable, clingy, dragging a child into drama. One post even implied Jonah was acting out and needed adult intervention, as if he were the problem, not the victim. Jonah saw it on a school computer, his heart hammering, his hands burning with anger, and in that moment he almost wanted to do exactly what Paige wanted most: react, shout, explode, give them proof he was out of control. But Jonah remembered Tessa, and he remembered his mother's eyes when she said to keep everything clean. Jonah didn't act on impulse. He pretended he didn't know, pretended he didn't care. He showed up on time, answered politely, sat quiet in class, nodded when the teacher asked if he was all right. While they thought Jonah was being shaped, Jonah was watching how they shaped him. He started collecting the technical traces adults often dismissed. Every time a teacher mentioned the email from the family, Jonah asked to see a printed copy, saying he wanted to understand the request so he could comply better. The homeroom teacher, thinking Jonah was cooperating, showed it to him. Jonah scanned the header, the sender details, the timestamp, and stored it the way you store answers during a test. When he had a chance, he photographed it using the library's tablet camera, labeling it like a lesson photo, then sent it to Tessa through a safe channel. Tessa taught Jonah how to read headers without hacking, how to identify an email's route, how to compare send times with Paige's appearances at home. Jonah followed every step quietly, like a diligent student working through a difficult assignment. He noticed the emails sent to the school were written in language too polished, too media-trained, and a phrase repeated in exactly Paige's style: emotional stability and protection from negative impact. Jonah also requested a copy of the new school schedule, the one signed off by an administrative office, and he saw the contact name at the bottom, an address that didn't belong to the school, an address tied to a consulting company he had seen on Paige's business card. Each small discovery made Jonah calmer, because it proved something simple. They weren't only controlling the story out there, they were trying to rewrite Jonah himself, turning him into a child who was off balance so that anything he said could be dismissed. By the weekend, Jonah was told he would meet with a counselor chosen by the family, and that it was because he was struggling. Jonah nodded and said thank you, and inside he could see the trap clearly. They wanted a record that Jonah was unstable, so if Jonah told the truth, people would say it was only the emotions of a child influenced by his mother. Jonah sat in his room and looked at the camera on the bookshelf, then looked down at the packet he had printed at the library, the email headers, the send times, the schedule changes, the vague articles that appeared on the exact days Paige held staff meetings. Tessa messaged that she had found a lawyer who could help through the proper process, and wasn't afraid of the Carlisle name. His name was Calvin Reese. Jonah didn't tell anyone in the house. He simply organized the papers into a folder the way a student prepares an assignment. And in a rare moment when he was allowed out under the excuse of tutoring, he changed direction and walked into a small office where Calvin was waiting. When Jonah set the folder on the desk, he didn't cry. He didn't ramble. He only said one short sentence, and his voice sounded far older than his years. They aren't only erasing my mom from the story, they're rewriting me. Calvin Reese's office wasn't in any gleaming tower. It was just a small mezzanine on a quiet street, a plain sign, warm yellow light, and the smell of old paper. Jonah walked in with his folder pressed to his chest like armor, and Calvin didn't look at him the way you look at a kid acting out. He looked at him the way you look at a witness trying to survive. Calvin was around 40. Voice low, hands steady as he turned each page Jonah had brought. But his eyes darkened line by line. He didn't ask Jonah if he hated his father. He didn't ask if Jonah wanted revenge. He asked the questions a trustworthy adult should ask. Who can confirm these are real emails? How did you get them? Did anyone force you to do anything illegal? Jonah answered clearly, saying he had only photographed what he had been shown or what was public, and he had guidance from Tessa Park to keep everything clean. Calvin nodded, like he had just watched a legal door swing open. He set the folder down and looked Jonah straight in the eye. Our goal isn't to humiliate your father in front of the world. Our goal is to protect you and protect your mother from being forced into silence. And most important, he added, we can't let them turn you into the unstable child story. Jonah swallowed hard and asked in a small voice what he could do. Calvin said there were things only adults could sign, and those things were the trap. He suggested Jonah let him contact Jonah's mother, but in a safe way. Jonah nodded, eyes red but not crying. Calvin called Tessa first, through a minimal encrypted channel. Then Tessa connected to Eleanor, and Eleanor passed the phone to Audrey. When Audrey heard Jonah's voice on speaker, she caught in her throat, her hand gripping the edge of the counter until it went white. Jonah tried to stay calm, saying only that he was okay. He was doing it right, and he had found a lawyer. Audrey wanted to ask 100 questions. Where are you? Are you being punished? Are you scared? But Calvin cut in gently, not rude, just enough to keep the call short and safe. He introduced himself, said he was standing for Jonah and Audrey's lawful rights, and he wanted to meet Audrey as soon as possible. Audrey was quiet for a beat, then asked a question that told Calvin she wasn't someone easily scared by paperwork. Are you going to turn this into a war? Calvin said no. War was what they were good at. We win with process. We win with a clean record. Audrey exhaled, as if for the first time in days someone had spoken a language she could hold on to. That afternoon, Audrey met Calvin at his office. Eleanor came with her, scarf wrapped tight as if to hide the trembling. Jonah wasn't there, because Calvin didn't want him discovered off his route. The meeting moved fast and clean, but every sentence carried weight. Calvin laid out what Jonah had brought, how Paige had intervened at the school, how the narrative was being built to paint Jonah as rebellious and Audrey as a manipulative mother. Audrey listened, and felt as if someone were squeezing her heart. She wasn't afraid of being talked about. She was afraid of them breaking her son. Calvin asked whether anyone had brought Audrey papers to sign. Audrey told him about the envelope and the non-disclosure agreement, the amount written out in words, the promise of safety attached to it. Calvin nodded, then opened a drawer and pulled out a copy of a document he had just obtained through a legal source, a file tied to property and residence arrangements the Carlyle family often used in internal setups. He placed it in front of Audrey. Temporary relocation agreement. Audrey stared at the title and felt cold shoot down her spine. Beneath it were soft lines about temporarily leaving the primary residence to recover and reduce media pressure, paired with clauses limiting contact and limiting speech. At the bottom was a signature line for Audrey, and the date line blank. Blank like a hole waiting for someone to fall in. Calvin spoke quietly, no theatrics. But each word landed like a nail. They prepared this to legalize your disappearance. They just need you to sign, or they need someone to create something that looks like your signature. Audrey lifted a hand to her mouth. Her eyes went red, not from weakness, but because she had just understood a hard, cold truth. She wasn't pushed out by a moment of anger. She was being moved like a chess piece. Eleanor reached under the table and held Audrey's hand. Audrey trembled, and Calvin watched the moment a mother wanted to let go, out of fear that her child would be pulled into a war of power. Audrey asked if Jonah would be all right. Calvin said Jonah was doing the right thing, but the more right he was, the more dangerous it became if they accelerated. Audrey closed her eyes, drew a deep breath, then opened them again, her gaze steady the way it had been before. Her voice was rough but clear, as if she were reassuring herself more than Calvin. We do it clean. Calvin nodded and began outlining the path. First, they had to block any attempt to force a signature. They had to establish that Audrey had the right to contact Jonah. They had to create a record that Jonah wasn't unstable at all, that he was being interfered with. But Calvin also said something that tightened Audrey's body. In the Carlyle world, they could drag everything out in the dark. They could make records disappear. They could make people afraid of their name. So they needed a stage where the truth was logged before anyone could edit it. Audrey asked what stage. Calvin met her eyes, voice firm. The Carlyle Foundation had an upcoming meeting with local press and donors. There would be cameras, minutes, people not inside their system. If Jonah and Audrey showed up the right way, said the right amount, with clean evidence, they wouldn't be able to cut the microphone without leaving a mark. Audrey swallowed hard, pictured Mason's face when cornered in public. pictured the counter-trap that could snap down on Jonah. Then she remembered Margaret's words. Remembered the way they had called her son a liability simply for knowing how to speak. Audrey placed her hand on the table and looked at Calvin. If that is the place they can't erase my son, then that is where we have to go. And when Calvin nodded, Audrey felt as if she had stepped onto a road with no way back, where the truth would have to walk through light, even if it shook an entire empire. On the night before the Carlisle Foundation meeting, the air inside the big house was stretched tight, but no one said it aloud. The staff still moved softly, set tea trays in the right place, drew the curtains on time, as if keeping everything ordinary would somehow make the truth ordinary too. Jonah sat in his room, replaying tomorrow in his mind like a door standing slightly open, the door Calvin had called the one place they couldn't cut the microphone. He knew if he managed to step through it, everything would change. And because of that, Paige knew she had to block him at any cost. Paige Holloway didn't think only like a communications director. She thought like someone hunting a leak. By late afternoon, she had already begun tracing quietly, without spectacle. She contacted internal technical staff, ordered checks on unusual logins, guest network access, connected devices, then set a small trap, subtle enough to catch the inexperienced. A link was sent by email disguised as an updated school schedule for Jonah, an attachment that looked harmless, and if anyone opened it from a certain IP address, Paige would know someone was watching. She aimed at Tessa, because Paige understood that IT people sometimes believed they were always one step ahead. But Tessa saw the trap from a distance. When the suspicious link arrived through a channel that didn't follow proper procedure, she didn't open it. She captured it, archived it, and sent it straight to Calvin as proof that Paige was escalating and trying to build a case to label Tessa an intruder. Tessa did what Paige hadn't expected. She proactively placed the entire package of evidence she and Jonah had gathered into a time-stamped legal archive system, then transferred a copy to Calvin before Paige could close the doors. It was like placing a duplicate of the truth into a lawyer's safe before the powerful man's house had a chance to burn. Paige believed she was pulling the thread back into her own hands. She saw small signals, a cache access, an unusual click, and concluded she was close to identifying the source. She immediately informed Graham and insisted the family must be protected before information was exploited. She sent Mason a brief message that tonight needed to be quiet, clean, and that Jonah must not leave control under any circumstances. Mason read it, and his eyes went cold. He didn't ask why. He issued a single instruction, and others carried it out. Jonah didn't know how those calls unfolded. He only felt the tightening once night fell. The supervisor lingered outside his room longer than usual. When Jonah stepped into the hallway to get water, he was gently stopped and told he should rest early, because tomorrow was important. Jonah asked what was important. The answer came that the family had arranged several matters, and Jonah simply needed to follow. Jonah nodded and returned to his room, feeling as though he had just pressed against a padded wall. He waited a while, then tried the door again. It opened at first, but as soon as he stepped 1 foot outside, the supervisor was there, as if expecting him. Jonah closed the door once more. This time, he heard a soft click from outside, a small sound, but enough to dry his throat. He tried the handle. It didn't move. Jonah stood still, his back turning cold. They didn't need to tie him up or shout. They only needed to lock the door and call it safety. He looked at the camera on the bookshelf, the lens like an unblinking eye. He felt anger surge hard enough to make him want to smash it, but he didn't. Breaking it would turn him into the unstable child Paige had already scripted. Jonah sat at his desk, breathed slowly, and thought fast. If tomorrow was the stage, he had to be there. If he wasn't, they would say he was ill, unstable, needed rest, and the story would close behind a polite smile. He searched his drawer, where he kept small things adults overlooked. Inside an old pencil case was a cheap backup phone, not linked to the family account, something he had bought with savings from selling collectibles, just to play at being grown in secret. He had kept it off for months. The battery was low, but enough for one call. Jonah powered it on, hands trembling, glancing around as if the camera could hear his heartbeat. He didn't call his mother, because he wouldn't risk dragging her into a traceable call. He called Calvin. The phone rang once, twice, then answered. Jonah spoke quietly and quickly, as if every second might be cut short. They locked my door. They don't want me going tomorrow. On the other end, Calvin didn't panic. His voice stayed steady, like an anchor. Jonah, can you hear me clearly? "Are you safe?" Jonah said he was safe, just locked in. Calvin asked if he could remain calm and avoid doing anything impulsive. Jonah said he wouldn't break the door. He just needed Calvin to know. Calvin told him to silence the phone, conserve the battery, and if possible send a short message confirming the exact time they locked it and who was outside, any detail at all. Jonah looked at the handle, listened to footsteps in the hallway, then said one final sentence that cut into the night like a thin blade. "They're trying to erase my voice." Calvin answered that they wouldn't let that happen. Jonah ended the call, hid the phone quickly, and sat on his bed, eyes wide open at the ceiling. Outside that room, Paige might have believed she was closing in on Tessa, and Mason might have believed locking a door was how you kept an empire safe. But Jonah knew that the very act of locking him in proved everything he had been trying to say. And tomorrow, if he managed to step outside, that lock from tonight would become the final piece of evidence that they weren't only erasing his mother, they were trying to erase his voice from the truth itself. The next morning, Jonah didn't break the door down. He didn't shout. He didn't do a single thing they could label impulsive. He only sat and waited, listening to the rhythm of footsteps in the hallway and measuring time by the sound of cars passing near and far. When the sun climbed higher, the lock clicked again. The door opened as if nothing had happened the night before, and the supervisor said Jonah had a scheduled appearance at a foundation event and needed to get ready. Jonah nodded, his face calm, but inside he knew Calvin had done something on the other side to make last night's lock stop short of becoming a true prison. They took him downstairs in a neat outfit. The car drove over the bridge. The city receded behind him, and ahead Jonah saw the building where the Carlyle Foundation held its annual meeting with donors and local press. The lobby was bright, the foundation logo set against a white backdrop, tasteful bouquets, polite conversation flowing like background music meant to soften anything sharp. Paige Holloway stood near the stage with a clipboard, one earbud in, directing staff the way you direct a performance that has already been rehearsed. Jonah walked in and felt as if he were stepping into the very picture Paige wanted to paint. The model family, the respectable charity, everything clean, everything safe. Mason sat in the front row, back straight, hands resting on his thighs, his face like stone, his eyes showing nothing but absolute control. If you didn't know the story, you would think he was simply a powerful man doing good for the community. Jonah looked at his father for a second, then looked at Paige, and he saw Paige's eyes sweep over him, the way you scan a risk. The meeting began with thanks, and with numbers spoken out in words, about scholarships, about support programs, about smiles captured at the right angle. Paige stepped to the microphone first, her voice smooth as she introduced the event, spoke of the Carlyle family as a pillar, emphasized privacy, emphasized that the family was in a season that required quiet so they could focus on what mattered. Jonah listened and understood. This was the stage Paige wanted, the stage where hard questions were covered with soft language. Mason didn't speak much. He only nodded at the right moments, offered a thin smile at the right moments, as if the entire room belonged to him. Then, at the side entrance, a small movement made a few heads turn. Calvin Reese walked in, no spectacle, just a simple suit, a slim briefcase in his hand, moving straight ahead like a man who knew he had the right to stand there. Jonah walked beside him. When Paige saw Calvin, her smile stayed in place, but the corners of her mouth tightened slightly, like a thread about to snap. Jonah didn't run to the stage. He walked slowly, came close to the front row, stopped, then turned to the sound coordinator and requested a microphone through proper procedure. Calvin produced a document confirming legal representation for the protection of a minor's rights and said, briefly, that Jonah had the right to speak. There was a moment of silence, not the silence of politeness, but the silence of people sensing something real was about to pierce the performance. Paige moved quickly, trying to stop it, but an older donor in the middle rows raised a hand and said that if the boy wanted to speak, let him speak. Paige had to step back, her smile still fixed, but her eyes cold now. Jonah held the microphone with both hands. His voice was a little rough at first, then it steadied. He didn't make it long. He did exactly what Calvin told him, spoke by timeline like a school presentation, except this time it was his life. Jonah said that in the past days, his mother had disappeared from every line of contact, and right after that, a campaign began altering the foundation website. He didn't say his mother's name through tears. He said it like a fact. He mentioned an internal memo, one short, clear line, and he read it word for word, so no one could claim he imagined it. Remove Audrey from frame. Keep Jonah centered. A few whispers rose. Jonah continued, saying he had evidence of timing and verification marks, that the changes happened on the same night as internal meetings. He didn't hold up the entire file yet. He showed only one piece that was easy to understand. A screenshot with a visible timestamp. A printed page Calvin had prepared where everyone could see the date and time in clear words. Then Jonah moved to what made the room go cold. He said that after the story about his mother began spreading, his school received an email from a family representative requesting restricted contact, schedule changes, and isolation from friends. Jonah showed the basic email header where the route and send time were displayed, and he said he hadn't hacked anything. He had only asked to see it because he was being told to comply. He looked straight at the adults in the room the way you look at a fair grading panel. "I'm not rebelling," Jonah said. "I'm being rewritten." Paige stepped closer then, her mouth opening as if to cut in, but Jonah raised the microphone a little higher, as if holding on to his right to speak. He didn't accuse his father with vulgar words. He didn't call anyone evil. He asked only one final question, a question that seemed to steal the air from the room. "If my mother is a liability, what does that make me?" There were no tears. Jonah stood straight, his eyes red but dry. That was what made it hurt. Some people in the room looked down, as if for the first time they could see the underside of the polished language. Mason still sat like stone, but his jaw tightened, a small muscle twitching once at the hinge, the only visible sign of impact. Paige couldn't take it anymore. She surged forward, her voice higher than before, insisting this was fabricated information, manipulation, that the boy was being influenced. She demanded the microphone be cut, demanded security intervene, her voice shaking from anger, not fear. But before anyone could move, the older donor who had spoken earlier stood, his voice calm but firm. "If you claim it is fabricated, then verify it here, now. I want to see the original documents and compare timestamps. Not tomorrow. Right now." The room broke into louder murmurs. Reporters began lifting their cameras, and Paige froze for one beat, because the stage she believed she controlled had just turned into a public interrogation room. The moment the donor demanded verification on the spot, the room shifted from a charity meeting into a confrontation. No gavel striking wood, and yet everyone felt the weight of it. Paige stood there, forcing her smile to stay in place like a mask beginning to crack. But Calvin had stepped up onto the stage by half a step with the calm of a man who trusted only records. He didn't argue with emotion. He didn't call Paige a liar. He said simply that if everyone wanted verification, he could present the evidence through proper procedure, without violating any law. Tessa wasn't physically in the room, but her presence lived inside every timestamp and every storage chain Calvin carried in with him. Calvin produced a printed copy of the email header, legally extracted from the email the school provided, showing the route, the send time, the relay servers, details most people wouldn't fully understand. But board members and donors were smart enough to recognize it wasn't a casually edited screenshot. He followed by placing on the table a timeline comparison, the moments the foundation website content changed, the moments older posts were altered, and the moments the family representative emails were sent, all aligned in a chain that meshed together like teeth. Calvin said that each key file had been stored with a third-party verified timestamp, meaning it existed in that state at that time and could not be created later and then pretended to be earlier. He didn't speak much, but every sentence was a nail hammered into the wooden frame of Paige's story. A board member who had been smiling politely earlier sat up straighter and asked Paige why an internal memo existed that instructed removing a person from the frame and prioritizing Jonah's image. Paige tried to push back, saying it was only internal language meant to protect the family's privacy, that every organization had communications protocols when facing a crisis. Calvin cut straight to the hinge and didn't let her hide behind wording. This is no longer privacy protection when there are signs of interference with a minor's school environment and signs of a pre-prepared agreement designed to force someone into silence. When Calvin mentioned a pre-prepared agreement, several donors turned toward one another because they understood it touched the ethics of a charitable foundation, where everything was supposed to be transparent. A reporter lifted a camera higher, and the small red light on the lens turned on like an eye-opening. The board began asking questions in a way that was no longer soft. Who approved the content changes? Who authorized the photo swaps? Who contacted the school? And most important, who gave the order? Paige looked around for something to hold on to, and at that moment, Graham stood up. Graham was the Foundation operations lead, the man who always hovered near Mason like a supporting shadow, and he spoke in a mild tone, as if he were helping Paige, while in truth he was pushing her into the center of the room. Graham said Paige was only a communications consultant, that all internal decisions had to go through operations, and that if mistakes occurred, Paige might have exceeded her authority. The words landed like a chair kicked out from under Paige. For a beat, Paige stared at Graham in disbelief, eyes wide, then turned to Mason as if asking to be saved. But Mason sat like stone, and that silence told Paige she had just been chosen as the sacrifice so the Foundation and the family could keep a clean distance from anything dirty. Paige swallowed and tried to recover her professional tone, saying she had only followed requests to protect the Foundation's image, that she had never intended to harm Jonah. But the board no longer accepted general lines. A donor asked bluntly, "Then who told you to do it? Who asked for the edits? Who asked you to email the school?" Paige turned toward Graham. Graham immediately lowered his gaze as if reviewing procedure. Paige turned toward Mason. Mason didn't move. Only his eyes went colder, deeper. And then the thing no one expected slipped out of Paige's mouth, a reflex from a person backed into a corner and terrified of being abandoned. She spoke louder than she meant to, her voice cracking with panic. "I followed the protocol." That sentence struck every polished decoration in the room like a slap, because it admitted this wasn't a single person's impulsive choice. It was a system, a standardized way of operating. The board fell silent for a beat. Then the board chair stood and said that to protect the Foundation's reputation and its responsibility to donors, they would order an independent audit immediately, freeze all communications and image campaigns involving the family until findings were reached, and open an internal investigation into interference in a minor's school environment and the use of confidentiality documents. Words like independent audit and freeze PR carried across the room and made many people understand this was no longer a family issue. It was a legal and credibility issue for an organization with money and scrutiny. Paige stood rigid. Graham stepped back as if his task of shifting responsibility was complete, and Jonah held the microphone, and his hands were no longer shaking. He wasn't happy. He didn't look victorious in any satisfied way. He only looked at his father, and in that moment, every gaze in the room, board members, donors, reporters, even the technical crew, settled on one person, Mason Carlisle, the boss in the front row, cornered in public, without darkness to issue orders from, without a door to close. The room waited for him to say something, anything, and that waiting hung in the air like a blade above them, sharp enough that everyone could feel it. If Mason opened his mouth, the empire would either save itself with words or expose itself with silence. After the moment when every eye in the room settled on Mason, the air grew so heavy you could hear people breathing. Mason stood up slowly, not rushed, not flustered, as if he still controlled the tempo, even though the stage had changed hands. He took the microphone in one hand. His gaze moved across the board, and the press the way it moved across faces he wouldn't allow to shake him. Then it stopped on Jonah. Only there did his eyes soften by the slightest degree, like a hairline crack appearing in a stone wall. Mason spoke one short sentence, no long explanation, as if more words would be weakness. He said everything he had done was to protect his family. "I did it to protect them." It was the only time he used that phrase, and the moment it left his mouth, another voice cut through from the back of the room, making the whole space flinch. Audrey had arrived. She didn't walk in like someone asking for her place back. She walked in like someone who had decided she would no longer live in the shadows, even if those shadows were called safety. Audrey stood in the aisle, her crutch tapping lightly on the floor like a punctuation mark, her eyes fixed on Mason the way you look at truth. She didn't argue. She didn't list accusations. She said only one line, so short it felt like a blade. "Protection doesn't erase a person." The words held Mason silent for a beat, and the room fell silent with him, because everyone understood this wasn't an attack. It was a moral verdict. Jonah stood beside Calvin, looking at his father the way you look at a stranger who has pulled on the mask of fatherhood to cover a system that crushed Jonah's mother. There was no longer fear in Jonah's eyes, the fear of a child locked behind a door. It was the gaze of someone who had just seen his father in front of the world and realized power could make people believe they were right while doing wrong. Mason looked at his son, and for the first time he saw something more frightening than any rival, more frightening than any headline, more frightening than an independent audit. He saw Jonah leaving him through his own clarity. He saw himself about to truly lose his child, not because of a court order, but because trust had cracked. The meeting ended in controlled chaos. The board called for a pause. Donors clustered in tight groups. Reporters chased the spokesperson. Paige stood as if the blood had been pulled out of her. Graham retreated into shadow, and Mason walked straight out a side door without another word. Audrey didn't chase him. Jonah didn't either. Calvin only touched Jonah's shoulder, as if reminding him the hardest part still hadn't arrived. The hardest part came after the lights, when power moved in closed rooms. And it did. Only a few hours later, at the Carlyle estate, the family meeting room opened, and Margaret Carlyle sat waiting as if she had known it would slide here. She didn't need to watch the video again. She didn't need to read the news. She only looked at Mason and spoke in the calm voice of a woman who treated scandal like noise. "You let a child humiliate the family in public." Mason stood across from his mother, shoulders still straight, but his face colder than usual, not from anger, but because he had just seen the cost of what his mother called protocol. Margaret said they had to crush it now. Tighten control. Pull Jonah out of Audrey's hands. Clean the story with a stronger force. She spoke like she was issuing orders to an entire bloodline, and by habit built over years, the men in the room were almost ready to nod. But Mason didn't nod. He looked at his mother, his voice low, not raised, but carrying the weight of a boss who could turn a house with one sentence. "No one gives orders in this house anymore if the order targets my son." Margaret's brow tightened for the first time, as if she couldn't believe her son would cut off her authority on her own ground. She said she was only protecting. Mason didn't give a long explanation. He said the kind of protection she called duty had turned his wife into a shadow and his son into a target. He turned to his people and issued orders in a tone that didn't allow argument. From now on, Paige was not permitted to approach Jonah or Audrey in any form. All contact with the school would go through counsel. Every change inside the house would be documented. It was the first time the people around him saw Mason use his power to block systemic violence instead of feeding it. Use the boss voice to build a barrier for the weaker, not to push them out of the frame. Margaret looked at Mason the way you look at a traitor to tradition, but Mason didn't blink. He was used to being hated. He wasn't used to being looked at by his son like a stranger. And then Jonah walked into the room, not sneaking, not shaking. He stood in the doorway like someone standing before a real court, looking at his father, looking at his grandmother, looking at the silent men around the table. Jonah didn't ask why anymore. He asked the question he had held back until now like a final blade. Choose. Me, or the throne. Jonah's question hung in the room like a cut you couldn't pull out. He looked at his son for a long time, as if for the first time he could see Jonah wasn't a child who could be soothed with safety anymore. Jonah was a person with the right to decide who deserved to be called father. But power didn't give Mason the luxury of reflection. By the next morning, the outside world had turned a family story into a public record. Donors called. The board sent formal notices. The press demanded answers. And most of all, the timestamps Calvin had presented were in too many hands for anyone to drag them back into the dark. Calvin didn't stretch it out with moral speeches. He moved through process. He filed an emergency petition in family court with lawful evidence that Jonah had been deliberately isolated, his school schedule interfered with, and that there had been an attempt to pressure one side into signing a confidentiality agreement with clauses restricting contact. Audrey walked into court on her crutch with a calm that was almost cold, because if she let emotion break open, they would call her unstable again. Jonah sat beside Calvin, not scanning the room for his father, only looking straight ahead like someone who had decided he wouldn't ask permission to tell the truth. Mason arrived later, without a loud entourage, only a family attorney, and his face held the familiar chill. But no one in that room looked at him like someone untouchable anymore, because his story now had timestamps. The judge didn't ask Mason if he loved his child. The judge asked specific things. Did Jonah have the right to contact his mother? Who ordered the phone taken? Who sent the emails to the school? And did any document exist intended to limit Audrey's speech? Calvin presented his case cleanly, offered only what was needed, not one extra word. He requested a temporary restraining order against any effort to pressure Audrey into signing any confidentiality agreement under duress or in exchange for access to her child. He asked the court to prohibit isolating Jonah from friends and school activities as a form of control, and he asked for a clear communication and residence plan so Jonah wouldn't be used like a rope in a tug-of-war. The court granted it faster than the Carlyle family was used to, not because the court wanted to take on a powerful man, but because the evidence was clean and the pattern had become too visible. The order was read in a cold legal tone, but to Audrey, each line felt like a rope pulling her out of the pit of being erased. Jonah was granted direct, regular contact with his mother. No one was permitted to confiscate devices. No one was permitted to block messages or alter school schedules for the purpose of isolation. Audrey was protected from any attempt to force her signature. Any meeting involving documents would require counsel and a reasonable review period. A temporary residence plan was set with Jonah's stability as the priority, and any changes had to be disclosed and recorded. Mason stood and listened, his hands still, his face unchanged, but inside he understood this was no longer a game of private calls. The truth was in the record now, and once it was in the record, it couldn't be buried with silence. Mason's attorney started to object on a few points, but Mason stopped him with a slight tilt of his head. He accepted the terms, not because Audrey had said the right sentence or Jonah had asked the right question, but because he saw what he had always feared, a public crack in the wall of power where any rival could slide a hand in if he kept denying. When the hearing ended, people rose, chairs scraping the floor in messy sound. Audrey leaned on her crutch, preparing to leave. Jonah walked beside her. Mason lingered for one beat, as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't find a sentence that didn't turn into strategy. At that moment, a man in a dark suit stepped closer to Calvin, carrying the composed presence of someone who worked for agencies that didn't need to raise their voices to be feared. He handed Calvin a card. He introduced himself as Vaughn, an agent connected to the audit and to irregularities in the Foundation's money flow. His tone was polite enough and firm enough that everyone understood this wasn't a social call. Vaughn didn't threaten Mason. He didn't talk about Mafia. He only said that when an organization is ordered into an independent audit, questions tend to lead to other questions, and they would coordinate through proper procedure. His presence didn't turn the story into an action scene, but it set a new stone on the table, financial and legal pressure heavy enough that even a boss had to recalculate every step. Mason looked at Vaughn, his expression unchanged, but his jaw tightened. He understood another fight was opening, and this time it couldn't be solved with the click of a locked door. In the courthouse hallway, Mason moved closer to Audrey and Jonah, keeping just enough distance that Jonah didn't step back, his voice low. "We need an agreement." Audrey looked at him, no longer trembling like she had in the diner days, because now she had law, she had records, she had light. She spoke clearly, not raising her voice, but every word was a boundary. "We co-parent, but I'm not coming back." Mason went still, and in that moment he understood the true price of erasing a person wasn't the audit or the headlines. The price was when that person stood upright, looked him in the eye, and said the return was no longer in his hands. After the court hearing, there was no scene of people holding each other under the rain, no soaring music in the background, only small but real changes, unfolding slowly and steadily, the way a crack is repaired by patient hands. Mason didn't hold a loud press conference to apologize. He didn't stand in front of cameras and talk about a hard childhood to justify himself. Instead, a few weeks later, a public announcement appeared on the Carlyle Foundation website about the creation of an accessibility support fund for people with disabilities and education scholarships governed by an independent board, not controlled by the Carlyle family, with transparent oversight mechanisms and regular public reporting. Audrey's name wasn't in the headline. Jonah's face wasn't on the banner. It was simply a structure built the right way, with clear bylaws and control placed outside Mason's hands. Many people called it a strategy to calm public opinion, but anyone who read the terms closely could see something else. Mason had stripped himself of a portion of his own control to correct a mistake born from his fear of losing control. It wasn't romantic, but it carried weight. In Hoboken, Audrey didn't return to the estate. She stayed in the small room behind Eleanor's diner for a while longer. Then she and Eleanor expanded the space into an afternoon community classroom. No big sign, no famous donor names, just a few long tables, a whiteboard on the wall, and children arriving with homework and hope. Audrey taught math, taught reading, taught them how to believe that moving slowly wasn't the same as being weak. The crutch was still there, but it was no longer a symbol of damage. It was proof that a person could keep walking even after being pushed out of the frame. Jonah moved to live near his mother under the new residence plan, an apartment not large but filled with light, with enough space for him to open a window without fearing someone would lock it from the outside. He still saw his father on schedule. He still spoke to him, but he no longer feared that every sentence he said would be turned into a file of instability. Jonah didn't become a media hero. He returned to being a student, the only difference being that he now knew his voice had value. One afternoon, when the community class had just ended, Audrey was stacking notebooks when Eleanor lightly touched her hand and nodded toward the glass door. Across the street, Mason was standing there. No long line of cars. No security stepping out first. Just one man in a dark coat, hands in his pockets, looking through the glass like someone who wasn't sure he had the right to walk in. Audrey looked at him, and in her gaze there was no fear and no dependence anymore. Only the clear distance of two people who had once loved each other and had hurt each other too. Mason didn't knock. He only asked Eleanor to bring in a small folded note. Audrey opened it. Mason's handwriting was straight and rigid like the man himself, but the message was no longer in order. He wrote that he wouldn't ask her to come back, and he would try to become someone she and Jonah didn't have to fear. I won't ask you to come back. I'll earn being someone you don't have to fear. Audrey folded the paper again. She didn't cry. She didn't smile too much. She understood. Some wounds don't vanish because of a promise. But some changes don't come from words. They come from a person accepting the loss of part of a throne in order to keep the human part that remains. This story didn't end with another wedding, or a perfect family under one roof. It ended with clear boundaries, with truth spoken in the light, and with each person taking responsibility for their choices. In life, sometimes the bravest thing isn't holding on tighter. It is letting go in the right place. Sometimes protection isn't locking a door. It is opening it and accepting that someone else has the right to walk away. Truth can shake an empire, but it can also save a child from being rewritten into something he is not. If you just listened to this story and felt a piece of your own life inside it, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Mason has truly changed? Or is this only the first step of a longer journey? Have you ever faced a choice between power and family? Tell us what you feel from deep in your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and share the video so we can keep bringing you meaningful stories every day. Thank you for staying until the end. Wishing everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.